Good morning and welcome to the CABE webinar Wednesday. Today we're looking at asbestos awareness with Ken Hanna. In this webinar, Ken will discuss the common asbestos-containing materials, ACMs, their typical pre-2000 uses and where they are often found in buildings, as well as outlining how to manage asbestos safely and comply with regulations. My name is Shanika and I'm the Training and Learning Coordinator here at CABE, and I'll be acting as moderator for this morning's session. We strive to create interactive webinars, so we do encourage you to submit any questions you may have during the session. These questions will be addressed at the end of the presentation. We'll get through as many as possible. If we do run out of time, we'll collect any questions and send them the answers out in due course. You can also contact webinars@cbuilde.com. If you're watching us live today, you can use the side panel to send in your questions. Alternatively, you can get in touch with us via the social links now on screen. Ken Hanna is an Associate Director and Principal Designer at Potter Raper. He's a member of the Institution of Fire Engineers, a charter member of CABE, and serves on the South Eastern Committee. Additionally, he's a committee member of the Association for Project Safety, showcasing his commitment to safety and professional excellence. So if you give me a couple of seconds, I'll just hand over to Ken and he will begin shortly. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the Asbestos Awareness Training for Building Surveyors and Inspectors, written particularly from CABE. My name is Ken Hanna, and I'm the presenter and the author, and I work for Potter Raper Ltd, based in our London office. My contact details will be provided by Shanika from CABE, should you require them. So what is asbestos and where did it come from? Well, it's been around for quite a long time, 5,000 years at least. It was used by cave dwellers in northern Europe to fill gaps between rocks to keep out the wind and cold, and it's still used for that today. 3,000 years ago, it was used by Egyptians for weaving into fireproof cloth for handling heated materials. 500 years ago, the more metalwork that was produced, the more asbestos was used as an insulator against the conducted heat. 100 years ago, asbestos cement and thermoplastics were made for exactly the same purposes. And 10 minutes ago, wherever there's a building built prior to 2000 and it's being demolished or refurbished intrusively, asbestos fibers and dust are disturbed. What is the objective of this training session? Well, my objective is to try and get across to anybody watching this webinar the moral and legal and financial implications of asbestos in the workplace, so that you can learn where to find asbestos in buildings and what kinds of products contain asbestos, and how to recognize where there's a possibility of asbestos-containing materials which, if broken, could release fibers and cause serious ill health and fatality. What does the Control of Asbestos Regulations 2012 require of us, and what do we do or not do about it? Well, first of all, it'd be good to start with what is a definition of asbestos as the regulations require. So asbestos is the general term used for fibrous silicates. Asbestos, the term asbestos also includes asbestos-containing materials, otherwise known as ACMs, which contain any of these fibrous silicates or even mixtures of them. Asbestos, known as blue asbestos, is crucidolite, brown asbestos, amosite, and white asbestos, chrysotile, and there are many variations, as we'll go on to see. So let's start with the moral. So like in all health and safety issues, we all have a duty of care. It's not just left to the health and safety consultant, manager, or advisor. It's up to all of us to protect ourselves and each other. So as human beings, we have that moral duty, either at work or in our private lives, to safeguard others from our and from others' actions or inactions. And it's important to recognize that doing nothing can be just as criminal as doing the wrong thing. The symptoms of asbestos-related diseases may not become apparent in the short term, but illness and death from asbestos-related diseases is a long and painful process. If we could eradicate asbestos from buildings, we would reduce pain and suffering by a considerable amount. As you can see, it's a prolific hazard. Currently, 125 million people in the world are exposed to asbestos in the workplace. Asbestosis, as it's commonly known, takes decades to develop, and there is no cure. In 2016, approximately 5,000 deaths in the UK were attributed to asbestos exposure. In 2022, the latest figures I've got, mesothelioma accounted for 2,257 deaths, plus a similar number of cancer deaths linked to exposure to asbestos. In the US, approximately 12,000 to 15,000 deaths per annum are attributed to asbestos exposure. Now, each year, it doesn't get significantly better, and one death is one death too many. But I think you can see that asbestos is probably one of the biggest killers, occupational killers, in the UK and worldwide. So what are the symptoms? Some of you may recognize these symptoms after our bouts of COVID. Respiratory dry cough or wheezing, shortness of breath, respiratory complications, fever or night sweats, fluid around the lungs known as pleural effusion, fatigue, muscle weakness, pain in the chest or abdomen. Now, these are also common in flu symptoms. So it's a very difficult thing to spot and to associate with asbestos. But unlike flu in the main or heavy colds, this is more likely to end in a fatality. So what is our role? Well, in managing surveys or inspections for refurbishment or demolition or construction projects in structures which predate the year 2000, employers and managers should enforce the processes which the client, duty holder, and principal contractor, other duty holders, should follow. We also have a duty of care to ourselves, colleagues, and others to work safely in compliance with the regs and within our own safety management system. For refurbishment and demolition projects, the checkpoints for clients, managers, and surveyors are that we should ensure that clients provide pre-construction information about asbestos in their asbestos register in the workplace, and the location of it and the type of it. And they must conduct a refurbishment and demolition, otherwise known as R&D asbestos survey, if a preliminary suitable assessment indicates that the building was built prior to 2000 and is likely to contain asbestos-containing materials. So firstly, the dynamic risk assessment should indicate if there is a doubt or if there's a certainty that there is asbestos in the building. If asbestos is even suspected, you must assume that it's there. A competent asbestos surveyor must provide an R&D survey before intrusive surveys or works can commence. If it is found pre or during the works, nobody should work in that area, and the HSE should be notified online. And this process takes 14 days. So it's very important that you get your asbestos R&D survey done well before the planned start date, because this could knock the programme straight away if it's discovered too late. You must ensure that a competent licensed removal contractor removes asbestos-containing waste to a licensed site and obtain a consignment note, which will say exactly the date, the type of asbestos that's been received, the quantity of that asbestos. So unscrupulous contractors who dump some of it in the countryside or fly tip it somewhere just to avoid paying the license site will soon be caught out, because your consignment note can be compared to what was taken away by the contractor. And even then, once it's been taken away, you must have a clean air certificate issued by a competent asbestos surveyor or the testing laboratory before the works restart, before they can restart even. So client duties in relation to asbestos, as described by the Association of Asbestos Removal Contractors, otherwise known as ARCA. ARCA guidance says Regulation 5 of the Control of Asbestos Regulations requires employers to identify the presence of asbestos, its type and condition, before building demolition maintenance work is carried out, and that includes inspections, intrusive inspections, and it includes intrusive surveys. So, for example, if you go into a ceiling void just to have a look round and you see any dust, then don't go into that ceiling void or don't poke about in it, because you could be disturbing asbestos fibres and then inhaling them. Where asbestos materials are liable or suspected to be present, a management plan should typically be based on the management survey and then the R&D survey. Now, a management survey is just a desktop survey to see is there an asbestos register, when was the building built, where are the hotspot areas where asbestos materials may have been used to insulate against cold and to protect against heat are the most common uses, but not the only ones. So any work that will disturb the fabric of the building requires a refurbishment and demolition survey. Surveyors and inspectors are not necessarily competent asbestos surveyors, so you mustn't conduct an intrusive assessment yourself if no R&D asbestos survey or pre-construction information indicating the location of possible asbestos has been received. Your dynamic risk assessment is based on your own experience and a site visit without disturbing ACMs, and based also on the history of the building. Now, if you don't know, you must suspect that there is asbestos present. So if in doubt, assume asbestos, advise the contractor not to start work or to stop work, and ask a health and safety advisor. I've got PR there for Potter Raper, but that's because I use this slideshow for our own mandatory asbestos training. A reference to work with asbestos in these regulations includes work which consists of the removal, repair, or disturbance of asbestos or materials containing asbestos. Work which is ancillary to such work, because that could disturb the fabric and could disturb the ACMs. And the supervision of such work. And so that includes people who are not necessarily surveyors, but may be innocent bystanders, because if dust and fibres are disturbed, everybody in the area could be inhaling them. So the HSE approved code of practice explains that asbestos awareness training should be given to employees whose work could foreseeably disturb the fabric of a building and expose them to asbestos, or those who supervise or influence the work. In particular, it should be given to those workers in the refurbishment, maintenance, and allied trades where it is foreseeable the ACMs may become exposed during their work. This includes, but is not limited to, tradesmen, contractors, engineers, architects, surveyors, and other such professionals. So what does it look like? Well, in its raw form, This is what it looks like, but you would not be able to identify it as such in a structure. But it is mined. It's a rock, and it isn't manufactured, but it's used in the manufacture of various building components, or it used to be before it was banned in the year 2000 in the UK. However, there's always the risk that somebody had some end of project materials, or that some might have been imported at a cheap price around the year 2000. So as a rule of thumb, I usually look to see if the work predated 2002, just to be sure that it wasn't accidentally included. So chrysotile is white asbestos, and it's used in roofs, ceilings, walls, and floors. Manufacturers also use chrysotile in automobile brake linings, gaskets, and boiler seals, pipe insulation, ducts, and appliances, obviously to protect against heat transfer. Brown asbestos, or amosite, was used most frequently in cement sheets and pipe insulation. It can also be found in insulating board, ceiling tiles, and thermal insulation products. Blue asbestos was commonly used to insulate steam engines, and that's crocidolite, and it was used in some spray-on coatings, pipe insulation, plastics, and cement products. And as you'll see as we go through this, virtually everything could include some form of asbestos if it predates 2000. Anthophyllite was used in limited quantities for insulation products and construction materials. It also occurs as a contaminant in chrysotile, vermiculite, and talc. It may have a grey, dull green, or white colour. Tremolite and actinolite are not used commercially, but they can be found as contaminants in chrysotile, asbestos, vermiculite, and talc. The chemically similar minerals can be brown, white, green, grey, or transparent, so again, there is no telling just by looking at them. All asbestos is dangerous. It's divided into two subgroups: serpentine, which encloses chrysotile, white asbestos, which was the most commonly used type of asbestos, and amphiboles, which include crocidolite, blue asbestos, amosite, brown asbestos, tremolite, actinolite, and anthophyllite, of which crocidolite was the most commonly used. Serpentine has curly fibers made up of sheets of crystals. The single type of asbestos from the serpentine family, chrysotile, has historically accounted for more than 95% of all asbestos uses around the world. Amphibole asbestos had needle-shaped fibers, and studies suggest it takes much less exposure to cause cancer compared to serpentine. And that's because the needle-shaped fibers get stuck in the lungs and in the body if they're inhaled or digested. Amosite and crocidolite are the most commercially valuable types of amphibole asbestos. Mesothelioma, a rare and incurable cancer that develops in the lining of the lungs or abdomen. Lung cancer, asbestos-related lung cancer, approximately 4% of all lung cancer cases in the UK. Ovarian cancer, the IARC confirmed that asbestos causes ovarian cancer recently as 2012. Laryngeal cancer, in 2006, the National Institutes of Health confirmed that asbestos causes laryngeal cancer. So as you can see, the science is still developing, and we're still identifying cancer fatalities. And I'm sure all of us, and I certainly have, lost friends to asbestosis, as it's commonly known. So asbestosis involves inflammation and scarring of the lungs, pleural plaques. These are the most common sign of asbestos exposure. They involve the thickening of the lining of the lungs, pleural effusion, a buildup of fluid around the lungs that causes difficulty in breathing, diffuse pleural thickening. Extending scarring thickens the pleural lining of the lungs, extensive scarring. Pleuritis, severe inflammation of the pleural lining, also known as pleuratic pain, and atelectasis, inflammation causing the lungs to underinflate. So here's a graph on the growth of discovery of mesothelioma deaths in 2016 from 1980. And as you can see, it's only in the current century that we have started to see a bottoming out of some of these figures. So deaths is the top one, projected deaths the next one, and various other stats demonstrating how common this disease is. So where might we encounter it? Because we don't encounter it in its raw form as a mined rock. So we can see here the red areas marked on this diagram courtesy of the HSE: asbestos cement roof sheets, slates, ridge vents, cowls, gutters, drain pipes, and water main pipes. And here vinyl floor tiles, even the adhesives for vinyl floor tiles, because it was protecting from the ingress of cold and protecting against the transfer of heat. Plastic WC ware, braided gaskets, and woven pads and fuse boxes. So very, very common to have asbestos in household products and any building construction materials. Asbestos, cement water tanks, flue pipes, asbestos insulation board linings. Insulation board used as a lining to practically any surface or even sandwiched in between fire doors. So looking at a metal fire door, you might think, oh, well, that doesn't have any asbestos containing material, it's metal. But actually, there is a sandwich in the middle of it, which helps to protect against fire coming through and certainly protect against heat. Wet applied boiler and pipe lagging may even be present beneath more modern products. So at that point, actually, beneath more modern products, it could be in the foundations of a building. And really, unless you were to completely demolish a building, you wouldn't know if it was absolutely 100% asbestos-containing material free, which is why we say that if you discover asbestos in a building, that you should stop work and have it analysed immediately and seal off the area until you know what it is. Loose packed underfloor thermal or acoustic insulation. And here are some of the typical uses of asbestos. There might be a garden shed roof of corrugated cementitious makeup. It could be lagging round pipes and valves. It could be on sprays, spraying onto the roofs or spraying onto the pipes themselves. It could be thermal gloves in order to carry hot items, thermal insulated gloves. And it could be being ground out in the workplace and being created into some sort of dust, which could be inhaled. Top left, or here are the floor tiles, but it could also be in the stair treads. It could be in collars. Pipes can be made of lagging, and even insulating tape can be made of asbestos. And then we have boilers, flues, drainage pipes, and artex on ceilings. So anywhere where there is hot water or hot air, or it's required to be insulated in some way, could have contained asbestos prior to the year 2000. And then anywhere around fuse boxes or tiles or lagging or valves, again, could contain asbestos in hard to identify locations. So what did the control of asbestos require? Well, what was previously non-notifiable must now be notified on the HSE on Form A5. If operatives have been working on asbestos, if they are asbestos removal contractors, from 2015, all operatives must undergo medical screening, and there must be detailed record keeping of all licensed and non-licensed work. So not just the licensed work. So who are the duty holders? The owner, landlord, or appointed manager of a property. For non-domestic premises or common areas of lease to renters, the person or organisation that has responsibility for the maintenance or repair through a tenancy agreement or contract. So this includes employers of organisations who are contracted to inspect or survey buildings. So what does it require us to do? Take reasonable steps to find out if there are materials containing asbestos in non-domestic premises, and if so, its amount, where it is, and what condition it's in. And then to make a record of that. Presume materials containing asbestos unless there's strong evidence that they do not. So you can't say it doesn't look like it's got asbestos in it. You have to say, I don't know if it hasn't, so therefore it probably has, or it might have, and I have to have it tested. So make and keep up to date a record of the location and the condition of these materials, because once they're broken, even if it's accidentally, it's a criminal activity. A regulation in this regard is not a wish list, it is an absolute requirement, a legal requirement. So we must assess the risk of anybody being exposed to fibres from the materials identified. And for doing licence work, the current regs require that employers must keep a health record for their employees, and they must also be kept under regular medical supervision. And that record must be kept for 40 years after the date of the last entry, particularly if an employee has been exposed. The record must show the date, time, and how long the exposure was, the type of asbestos, and the level of asbestos that person was exposed to. So once you discover you've got it, you can encapsulate it or have it removed. If you encapsulate it, then you have to monitor where it is, put it into an asbestos register, describe the type and the quantity and the location. So this is known as a management plan. So periodically review and monitor the plan and the arrangements to act on it so that it remains relevant and up to date. And as I said before, provide information on the location and condition and who is likely to be able to work on that area. An employer must not undertake any work in demolition, maintenance, or other work which is liable to expose employees of that employer to asbestos. So it's a criminal offence if you do as an employer. And unless there is a suitable and sufficient asbestos assessment, R&D survey, as to whether asbestos, what type of asbestos, contained in which material, and in what kind of condition it is present or is liable to be present. Always assume that asbestos is present unless you know for sure it isn't. If no records are available or there are any doubts about their accuracy, employers may need to arrange a survey and analysis. Well, actually, they will need to arrange a survey or analysis of representative samples to determine the facts. Alternatively, employers should assume that the part of the building to be disturbed contains the most hazardous type and apply the appropriate control measures using a licensed removal contractor. For construction projects also within the scope of the CDM Regs 2015, clients have to provide pre-construction information to designers and contractors. This will include information held by the client perhaps in an existing health and safety file or in an asbestos register, on the presence of asbestos and its type and condition. An employer must not carry out any work which is liable to expose employees to asbestos unless there's been a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risk, so R&D survey, and that the significant findings of that risk assessment have been recorded as soon as practically possible. So you need to determine the nature, degree of exposure, consider the effects of the control measures, consider the results of monitoring of that exposure, set out the steps to be taken to prevent that exposure or to reduce it, consider the results of any medical surveillance, and include any additional information for the risk assessment. An employer must not undertake any work with asbestos without having prepared a suitable written plan of work detailing how it's going to be carried out. So if you suspect that there is asbestos or ACMs present, you must get an R&D survey. And if you are going to be doing intrusive inspections or surveys, then you shouldn't be doing that until there is such an R&D survey. If, however, you're just having a look and you're not disturbing the fabric of the building, that is allowable. But beware of dust and disturbing dust. So in the cases of final demolition or major refurb, the plan of work must, so far as is reasonably practicable, specify that asbestos must be removed, or it could be encapsulated, before any major works begun. So license, non-license, notifiable, non-notifiable, it's a bit of a circle. So it is easier to say that the R&D asbestos survey will advise if it's notifiable or not notifiable and who to notify it to, but it's usually the HSE in the construction industry, and also if it's licensed or non-licensed. So you don't have to decide, because after all, you don't know what kind of asbestos you're looking at, and you don't know what the condition is and the seriousness of it. So it's relatively easy to release asbestos fibers when working with asbestos insulation, coatings, and asbestos insulation boards. In most cases, only those with a license should carry out, well, in all cases actually, should carry out work with these materials. However, licensing will not apply to short duration work where the risk assessment shows the work will produce low intensity exposure. So this may be a small amount of floor tiles where the adhesive contains asbestos. So in removing a small amount of tiles, then that could be viewed as low intensity exposure and not exceed the control limit. But the control limit, as we'll go on to see, is quite low. Not all work with asbestos-containing materials requires a license. However, all work with sprayed asbestos coatings, insulation or lagging, and most work with asbestos insulating board requires a license because of the hazardous nature of these higher risk materials. For information when you might require a license and the application process, look at your survey. Your survey will advise you if it's notifiable or not, non-notifiable, and if the work is licensable or not licensable. For licensable work, certain types of work with ACMs can only be done by those who have been issued with a license by the HSE. Where any worker is exposed to asbestos, where any worker exposure to asbestos is not sporadic nor of low intensity, the control limit is a very small 0.1 airborne fibers averaged over a 4-hour period. Work on asbestos surfer coatings for heat or sound insulation where the work is not sporadic, not short-term, not of low intensity, or the control limit will be exceeded. Now, you can see what I mean about it being circular and complicated, so just rely on your R&D survey. If in doubt, get an asbestos-approved contractor. from the best place to find that is from the Association of Asbestos Removal Contractors, ARCA, and they keep a register so that you can check which contractors are competent in your area. And they will provide you with the date and time, the how long the exposure was, the type, and the levels of asbestos. So non-notifiable license work, very large-scale removal of textured coatings beyond that required for maintenance activities. So you might find that you're refurbing or inspecting a building for multiple floors, all with asbestos-containing floor tiles or ceiling tiles or adhesive in them. So a lot of low-intensity materials are viewed by the HSE as important work, and that they must be controlled and taken to a licensed site. Particularly if they're unbonded, and fracturing them might create the release of fibres. You must keep a record of the information, instruction and training received by each individual. You must support individual workers in demonstrating their knowledge, so i.e. give them asbestos awareness training, which is what we're doing here. And the procedures for providing information, instruction and training for licensable work should be clearly defined and referred to in a written document. So the risk assessment for whether or not there is likely to be asbestos present before you carry out the R&D survey must be reviewed if there's reason to suspect that the existing risk assessment is no longer valid for any reason, if there's a significant change in the scope of work to which the risk assessment related. So it may be that there's an additional room added or additional area added to the scope of works. You must carry out a R&D survey on every area to which the scope of works is extended to. It should have the results of any monitoring carried out pursuant to show it to be necessary, and there has been a significant change to the work method chosen or design materials or installation of rerouting of cable, etc. So our training aims of learning where to find asbestos in buildings, what kind of products are likely to contain asbestos, how to recognise there's a possibility of ACMs, what does CAR 2012 require us to do, and what do we do and not do about it, I think we've covered. If we haven't, then please let me know. The options for managing asbestos, if you don't have it removed, if you have it encapsulated, for example, it must be labelled and monitored by a competent person. It's usually in yellow with warning signs, and that any yellow sticker in a building tends to indicate the presence of asbestos. It has to be encapsulated, usually by a licensed contractor or removed by a licensed contractor, and you must review your plan on a regular basis. The duty to manage asbestos includes the person identifying should be qualified, assessing should be competent, sampling should be by a P402 surveyor, analysis only by a licensed laboratory, and recording by the premises management or owner or agent of the owner. All asbestos surveyors will have successfully completed the required course, building surveys and bulk sampling for asbestos, and must hold the proficiency certificate. So again, be wary of unscrupulous people who claim to be, they have to have the P402 issued by the British Institute of Occupational Hygiene. All firms should have applied for accreditation of bodies surveying asbestos in premises from UCAS, and they should have current professional indemnity insurance. So if they haven't got any of that, then they are not deemed to be a competent asbestos surveyor or asbestos removal contractor if they're not a member of ARCA. Materials cannot be presumed of asbestos-free unless there's strong evidence to conclude that they're highly unlikely to contain asbestos. So there are obvious materials such as wood, glass, single skin metal, stone, which don't, but there are many examples of asbestos being present inside materials as a sandwich layer, and we've already said doors, columns, under column casings, hidden side of items. So you can often find a board behind a boiler or an oven in a residential building, and it's there to prevent heat from breaking through and setting fire to the materials on the other side. So, e.g. wood paneling, ceiling tiles, and under veneers. As I said before, even R&D surveys do not identify all asbestos. So contractors and operatives should at least undertake an asbestos awareness course so that they're alerted to the possibility that what they're removing or drilling into could contain asbestos. And if they suspect that dust or fibers are coming off, they should immediately withdraw, inform the responsible person, and segregate the area and cease work until it's proven not to be asbestos or it's removed. So the old issue of management surveys being sufficient is no longer the case and hasn't been since 2012. There are only two types of survey. The desktop survey, which is now known as the management survey, where you're just really doing a dynamic risk assessment. What's the age of the building? What are the chances it's got asbestos? Now, be wary here, because you could have a building that's built following a demolition, and that demolition of the building could have occurred after 2000, but the original building may have predated 2000. And so the foundation slab and the ground around that slab could contain fibers if it wasn't demolished properly and didn't have the proper R&D survey to identify. I've done some work on a children's park in London, and we had the ground tested, and it was full of asbestos fibers from the surrounding houses, which had in turn been refurbished over the years, and the fibers had floated onto the park. So another job I was on, the slab that they were going to use, having demolished the building to rebuild the next building, wasn't of sufficient strength. And when they dug it up, they found a whole load of exploded bomb damage to buildings which contained asbestos-containing materials, and it cost them over $1 million to have it removed to a licensed site. So R&D surveys are the cheapest way to go about ensuring that you don't end up breaking the law or have an even bigger bill. So the survey guide, appointed person commissions a survey. The first is a desktop survey, the management survey, and that goes into investigating what might be there. And then the R&D survey will be the intrusive survey as an inspection for all work areas, so the scope of works for suspect asbestos-containing materials. And even the management survey has to be reviewed by a competent survey person. So again, in the survey, location, condition, and quantity, anything found should go into the asbestos register for the building. There should be a management plan and a regular review. So it is essential where refurbishment or major or demolition works are to be carried out. Great emphasis on sampling all the areas of the premises where work's going to be carried out. Must not work on the building unless there is an R&D survey. If you're carrying out any intrusive work whatsoever, even drilling into floors, because as you've seen, it can be in floor tiles and beneath floorboards and behind walls. Removals only by a licensed person, and your surveyor will advise on notifiable and non-notifiable work and on licensed and non-licensed work. So we've covered the need to consider the works of contractors when assessing ACMs, and records can be improved with photographs for ease of identification, particularly in hard to access areas. So we've now reached the end. So aims achieved: learn where to find asbestos, what kind of products contain it, how to recognise there are possibility of ACMs, what the law requires, and what you should do. I hope we've covered. We all have to be vigilant to ensure that competent persons are employed in this and not the cheapest and quickest system, and we must make records. That is the end of the presentation. So thank you for attending, and if you have any questions, Shanika will be forwarding them to me and I'll be able to share my answers with you. Thank you.